All right, welcome to LouTube and this lesson on using the quadratic equation. And before we actually use the quadratic equation, I'm going to show you where it's derived from. As a grade 10 student in math, you're generally not required to be able to do what I'm going to do, is complete the square of the standard form of the quadratic equation, which is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. But you may want to follow along and watch me go through it. If you don't, just continue through the video, fast forward, jump ahead a bit till I'm finished this part, and you can watch me using the quadratic equation on a few examples, okay? So we're going to start with doing this, and if we wanted to complete the square here, the first thing we would do is we would move the c to the other side, and at the same time I'd divide everybody by a. So if I do that, I get c over a here. I get x squared because a over a is 1 plus b over ax, and then I want to find a c value that I'm going to put in here, and the c value will be b over 2a squared. So I take half of my b value, which is b over 2a, and I square it. And so I'd add that b over 2a squared right in here, and then I'd add that here, which is b over 2a squared. And this is where things get a little tricky. It's quite easy to make the perfect square here, which is simply going to be x plus b over 2a, and that's going to be squared. But over on this side, I want to actually add these two things together. And the best way for me to do that is kind of go over to the side and do that. So if I've got c over a plus, and I'm going to change that to b squared over, and then I'm going to square everything on the bottom, which would be 4a squared. And then I got to look for what's my common denominator here. Well, I need an a. I need another a here, so I need that squared, so that'll add an a to the top. And then I need a 4, so I multiply by 4 over 4 here. And so what I've done is I've created a common denominator there, and that allows me to add these two things on the top together, okay? And that should, by the way, be minus c. Sorry, so this ends up becoming minus 4ac out front. And so it's typically written as, when we do this math, we come down to here, we typically write it as b squared minus 4ac. So we reverse the order. We put the b squared out in front, and we'll subtract the minus 4ac. And then we have 4a squared on the bottom, 4a squared on the bottom. And that's quite a complicated thing here. There's hardly any numbers. It's all letters and whatnot. But that is essentially how it works. Now, what we want to do is take the square root of both sides. And when we do, we're going to take the square root of the bottom and top separate. And the reason is because we have a perfect square on the bottom. So we end up with plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a on the bottom, because when we take the square root of 4, we get 2, and the square root of a squared is just a. And then over here, we get x plus b over 2a. And this allows us, I'm going to scroll up here, this allows us now to finish the quadratic equation by bringing this term over to the other side where it becomes minus, and we write it out in front. So it becomes minus b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. And the nice thing here is that we essentially have a common denominator here. So that's what x is going to equal. And in the end, we write the equation as minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, I missed the c up here, my bad, and all over top of 2a. And you'll notice that this bar goes all the way over because we take the square root of this whole answer in here, and this is x. Okay, and the way this works is that we go to any equation. If we can determine the a value, the b value, and the c value, then we can substitute those values into this equation, and then we can get our answer. Okay, so let's do a couple of examples like that. Of course, this is not done if we can factor, because factoring is still easier, but this is better than completing the square. Okay, so generally speaking, on a unit test, you're going to get one question where you're asked to complete the square, maybe two, and then we usually jump to using the quadratic formula. Okay, and here's the quadratic formula. You'll see this posted around the room. It's not required for you to memorize it, although after using it 100 times you will eventually come down to memorizing it. It's just one of those things that we do. Okay, just kind of the way it kind of tends to work. Okay, so what happens here is typically I ask kids, can you find A, B, and C for me? Let's find A, B, and C. And so A is 1, B is -5, and C is -14. And then it's a matter of substituting those into the quadratic formula. Now, as a general rule, I always require students to write the quadratic formula out. And that's part of what you have to do. And it's like a free mark. If you don't write it out, you're not getting that mark. Okay, so it's x equals minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. Make sure you get your bar right over top, and then all over 2a. And now you're going to substitute in. Okay, and leave myself a ton of room here, but it's still doable. A is 1, so wherever there is a 1, A, you're going to put a 1, B is going to be -5, C is going to be -14, and away you go. So we'll start with the B, -5. It is minus B, so that makes it a +5. So I don't have to write +5, but if you want, write +5, plus or minus the square root of B squared, which is going to be -5 squared. Okay, that's going to be 25. I'm going to be honest, a lot of times when I substitute, it's good to substitute the numbers in, but sometimes I'll cheat and I'll write 25 there instead, okay? And then it's going to be 4 times 1. Well, I don't need to write 1. 4 times 1, we know what that is. It's just 4, right? And it's minus and then -14, okay? And then that's going to be all over 2 times 1, which is just 2. Okay, and then I'll often go like this. I'll say x equals, and then I'm going to simplify what's underneath the square root sign to the best of my ability. And this is where I'll probably grab my calculator, but really I don't even need to if you're pretty good at math. This is going to be 25, okay, here, and 14 times 4 is going to be 56. The minus times a minus is going to make this a plus, so it's going to be 56 plus 25, and that's going to give you 79. So I'm going to write +5 plus or minus the square root of 79 all over 2, and that's as far as I can go, and I have my answer all done. Did I do 79? That's not 79. What am I doing? 25 plus 50 is 75. That's 81. Is that right? Just double check that numbers. I'm being silly here. Get my calculator out and do a little bit of math in my head, and I got 25 plus 56 equals 81. That sounds more like it. That would be 9 and 81 here. I recognize my error. Let me erase that. See, I make mistakes too. You're allowed to make mistakes. Just make sure you correct them whenever you can. Okay, so this would actually work out to be x equals +5 minus 9 over 2, which would be an answer like x equals, what is that? 5 minus 4 over 2 would be -2, and x over here would equal +5 plus 9 over 2, and that would work out x equals 7. And so the two answers would be x equals -2 and 7, and worked out to nice even numbers. I bet you if you look back and you try to factor this, you'll see that this was factorable, and so there was no need to use the quadratic equation, because you could see here factors of 14 that have a difference of 5, 7, and 2, and so -7 plus 2 would have given me +7 and -2 for my answers. Anyway, we went through some of that rigmarole just to show you how the quadratic equation works, but really factoring would have been easier there. So here in this particular question, we could check for factors. I'm not going to. I'm just going to go ahead and use my quadratic equation. So A is 2, B is 8, and C is minus 42. And I'm going to write my equation out. X equals minus B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC, and then all over 2A. And look at me, I'm writing this out with a weird pen on a computer screen every time when I'm doing examples for you. You can do the same for me when you're writing it out on a test, okay? And it is worth marks. So X is going to equal minus 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times 2 times C, which is minus 42. And I'm going to bring that over, all over 2 times A, which is 2 times 2. And now it's just a matter of simplifying everything out. Now this is where I'm going to want to get my calculator out again. So I grab my handy dandy calculator, and I'm going to do the part in underneath the bracket. So I'm going to start with X equals minus 8 plus or minus, and I'm going to get my answer to this part under here, which they actually refer to. It has a name. It's called the discriminant. Okay, so typically, you can go about it any way you want. You can just write 8 squared minus 4 times 2 times minus 42, or you can actually do one part and work it out yourself. You have to figure out how best to use your calculator in this situation. For me, I can see 42 times 2 times 4 is going to be positive because I have the 2 negatives, and then I'm going to, what was that there, 42 times 2 times 4 equals 336 plus another 64 equals 400, and that is a perfect square as well, 400 I believe. And then underneath this is going to be 4. And so I'm going to end up with 2 answers here because the square root of 400 is 20, right? 20 times 20 is 400, I believe, right? 20. Oops. That's right. Okay, so 20 is the square root of 400. I was just double checking because sometimes I make mistakes, right? So X equals minus 8 plus 20 over 4, and X equals minus 8 minus 20 over 4. And so we can do the math here. This will be 8 minus 8, 12 over 4. This is going to X equals 3. And over here, 4, X is going to equal minus 8 minus 20 is minus 28 divided by 4, which would be minus 7. And again, if you factored this out, you worked it out, you'd probably see that those are the correct answers by factoring. To me, factoring would still be the easier method here, but I'm teaching you how to use the quadratic equation when it comes out to a nice, easy answer. Now, here's a tricky one. We'll do the last one here, whereby which hopefully it doesn't work out to a nice round number again, but I give you the equation where it's just equal here. You must rearrange this to be 5x squared, bring the 3x over, bring the 1 over, so it's going to be minus 3x plus 1 equals 0, okay? And if we don't do it by factoring, because we're practicing quadratic equation here, I'm going to say A equals 5, B equals minus 3, and C equals 1. And then I'm going to write my equation out. X equals minus B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. As you might expect, I have it well memorized. And then I'm going to start substituting in. Minus B, that's going to be positive 3 because that changes the sign, okay? Plus or minus, then the square root of minus 3 squared, that'll be 9. Then it'll be minus 4 times A, which is 5, times 1, okay? And that is going to be all over 2 times A, which is 5. Okay, so now we're going to start doing some more math here, and I'm going to do all the work inside the bracket here. So that is going to be 9 and a minus 20. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's correct. That's right. Minus 20. Okay. Thought I made a mistake. And so what you end up with here is x equals 3 plus or minus the square root of minus 11 over 2 or 10. But once we have this, we have no real solution. So there's no real solution that we can find here. Many of the answers that you will do in using the quadratic equation will come up with answers of a square root. They'll be positive. That's just the way it works because they're not factorable. If questions are factorable, that's when you get whole number answers. And so if you get a whole number answer using the quadratic equation, you probably could have factored it, okay? But as soon as you get a minus under the square root sign, there's no real solution. We cannot possibly have an answer there. So yeah, it's just the way it works sometimes, and there is no answer to this particular equation. No numbers can be substituted in for x that will actually make it equal to 0. All right, so that is the lesson on using the quadratic equation. I hope you do learn to memorize this eventually. It is posted on the wall in the classroom, and this is probably a lot easier than completing the square, and most students prefer using this method, although on a unit test you will be required to do factoring, completing the square, and the formula. All three are a requirement of grade 10 math. Hope you enjoyed that. See you next time on LuTube.